Alrighty, so we're live on YouTube, so that's good. My name is Joshua Goodeye, for those of you that know. We're at the Angular Meetup. Tonight we have Jack Frosch that is going to do a talk on Groovy and Grails for the Angular Hub. Take it away.
Alrighty. It's my pleasure to be here. It's somewhat foreign topic for me, as we will discuss here in a little bit. Some of it's familiar and some of it's new to me, and so it represented quite a challenge. A little bit about me. So my first career was doing that stuff. So I was in aviation primarily. I was in the Navy for a short while, and then I ended up flying the F-4 at the closeout of my aviation career. I've flown basically all those types of airplanes and others. And then I went to work at NASA and worked on the space station project for a while, and then got into full-time software development and have been there really since the early 90s. And I'm currently a member of the Grails team with OCI, and so I do know a little bit about Grails and Groovy, and I'm starting to do a little bit of Angular 5. And it was actually as I got into the Angular 5 and the TypeScript that it occurred to me that this is there's enough syntactic and semantic similarities between how TypeScript does things and how Groovy does things that it really is, if you've invested the time into learning TypeScript, it really is a fairly straightforward transition to start dipping into Groovy. And why would you want to do that? Is because Grails is written in Groovy, and it's a great, great web framework. And you can do Groovy in sort of any Java, web framework like a Spring Boot or whatever, but Grails is really built from the ground up with Groovy. And there's some other things that are coming along that I'll mention a little later that you might be interested in, also that are Groovy-based. And then Groovy's showing up in a lot of places. So if you've heard of Gradle for a build system, for if you do any Android or anything, that's an official build system. That's basically built up on Groovy. And in Spring, there's a lot of Groovy stuff that's shown up in Spring. And you can use the Groovy beans DSL to declare your beans in Spring. And so Groovy is really worthwhile to learn if you're going to do server-side development, even if you're not going to do Grails. But if you're going to do Grails, it's a must. So we're going to talk about these things, how to get started. So how many people here do anything on the server side with Java or Groovy? One, couple? Okay. Everybody else is client side? So can I take that? How many are doing Angular, not the classic Angular JS, but just the new Angular TypeScript? Okay, good. What's everybody else here for? Just the pizza, right? All right. So anything else? Any other? Which one? .NET. Oh, .NET. Yeah. Okay. So there are going to be some familiar things here because one thing we like to do is borrow technology from each other. So when someone comes up with an interesting solution in one platform, it rapidly gets adopted into another. So we'll kind of do some comparison between Groovy and TypeScript. I'm going to do a very brief introduction to Groovy, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about Angular and Grails. And I'm going to show you a couple of demos in there. And then I just have a slide about the deployment options, of which used to be not many choices. You made a WAR file and you deployed it into a container someplace. That was, pre-Grails 3.0. Now with Grails 3, there are a few more choices that you have, and so we'll talk about that. So, how much we each know about TypeScript and Angular. Well, this is probably you guys, and this is me. And I'm pretty new to it, and very new to it. I don't do it as a rule on my contract assignments at all. I pretty much am in the Grails and the server-side stuff. But I do find a lot of what's going on in the Angular framework world interesting. I know there's a lot of competitors with Vue and React and some of the others, but we sort of have a consensus that component model is the right way to go. And Angular has, I think, has some distinct advantages. And some people in the classic JavaScript world hate TypeScript because of the typing and whatever, and they prefer to have 17 nested functions inside of each other, and that is perfectly fine for them. But I think TypeScript helps bring a discipline to the coding that, if you've ever reviewed some Wild West JavaScript, you know that sometimes discipline is lacking in the JavaScript side.
Your screen stuff.
Oh, did it? Sorry. Let me pop off here and
1 second.
make sure we got a good share going.
So you share again.
All right. Sorry about that.
Perfect.
Yeah, you keep an eye on it for me. All right. So this is how much we each know about Java, Spring, Groovy, and Grails. This is probably me because I don't do hardly any Angular stuff. And this might be you, although for those of you doing Java. But on some days, this is me too. I mean, it's like you're trying to figure out why it's not working, why Grails is doing this, or why Spring Boot is behaving this way. And you just feel like there's so much to learn. And the framework, we'll talk about where Grails comes, but Grails is built on top of Spring, and Spring is a massive framework that has many, many possibilities. But as a result of it, you often feel like the small pup in the big pound. So don't feel bad if this is you, because this is where I am with Angular, and it's just a learning process. Now, the things that are Groovy and Grails, Groovy is a JVM language, and it's really built on top of Java. It's really a close cousin to Java. But there are lots of APIs and things in the Java space that you might use in a real-world application. You definitely will use the Servlet API, and you'll use Spring stuff, and you'll use Spring MVC and Spring security stuff. You might use MongoDB or Hibernate. All of these things are really interesting, and I just don't have enough time to talk much about them. Gradle is written in Groovy, or written for Groovy anyway. I don't know what its core language is. Most of it is probably Groovy. And Spock is a testing framework. And even if you're doing Java development, Spock is a great framework for testing that. But I can only sort of touch the tip of the iceberg, and I can't cover much. But I hope what you get going forward, you'll see there's enough comfortable feeling in the TypeScript to Groovy comparison that if you're comfortable with TypeScript, I think you'll feel yourself pretty comfortable moving to Groovy. So to get started, I have to sort of lay this out. Because Groovy and Grails are, they run on a JVM, you need to have the Java development kit installed, right? Which is a compiler. It has a compiler, and it has some tooling, and it has the Java runtime and everything. So you can download. The official one is Oracle because Oracle bought Sun, and so that's the official. There's also an OpenJDK project, and you can get the OpenJDK. Just go to the link on Oracle and accept the license, and it's free, and download it and install it. And there's installers for Windows and Macs and Linux. For Groovy, one way to do it is to go to the Groovy site and download a zip file, and you just unzip it, and now you've got Groovy available in your system. For Grails, the same thing. You can download Grails as a zip file if you want. Now, if you're in a Linux or Mac world, then there's a really great tool called SDK Man. And who's used like NVM for doing like management of versions of NPM and whatever node, whatever it does. It's similar to that, but this is for Groovy. It does Grails. It does Java. So there are a bunch of different versions of Java, and you can install each one of them, and basically it caches it into your system, and then you can specify what the current version you want to use is. The current version of Grails is 3.3.3, but I often find myself going to 3.2 something because that's what we're using on some projects at the client that I'm at, and so I want to see it behave in that version and not the current version. And so this makes switching, it's just a command line thing. You just say basically SDK use Grails 3.2.12 or whatever, and you get it. And so it's a great tool. So if you are in the Linux or Mac world, you want to use it. It's Bash based. Actually, I am not sure that Windows 10 with the Bash, with the Linux, whatever that's called, the Linux runtime that they have on there, if you couldn't use it on that, but I've never tried it. So let's talk a little bit about TypeScript and Groovy, right? So the original commercial on Reese's was like, hey, you know, you got your peanut butter and my chocolate, right? It's like these two things that you would think are like two different worlds. TypeScript's over here in the JavaScript world, and Groovy's over here in the JVM Java world, and like, how do they even match? But there's enough semantic similarities, and by that I mean the meaning of the way we do things means the same. So when we define a class in TypeScript, it means, semantically means the same thing as when we define a class in Groovy. Now, under the covers, their purposes are completely different, right? But I mean, the way they end up, the TypeScript is really there to end up getting compiled into some, sometimes some fairly gnarly JavaScript, but it does, semantically, we're talking about, you know, an object type, and it's just really nice. And there's some really sweet syntactic sugar things that both languages do that are similar, and we'll take advantage of those. Now, I'm going to do a lot of analogizing here, but as Freud said, you know, analogies, it is true, decide nothing really. But they can make one feel more at home, and that's why I'm doing this talk. It's not that everything you know in TypeScript is going to transfer over exactly into Groovy. That is not the point. The point is that if you're comfortable in TypeScript, then when you move to Groovy, you're going to feel kind of at home because it feels kind of like what TypeScript is doing. So TypeScript, for instance, we write once in our TypeScript. It gets compiled to JavaScript, which allows the code to then be run on a host of browsers that would not natively support TypeScript. For Groovy, we write once and we compile to bytecode, and this allows execution on a Java virtual machine that is available on many different operating systems, everything from PCs all the way up to IBM mainframe ZOS, right? So, so we have this comfortable feel. I know when I'm writing that the intended audience to consume this is not the particular OS I'm writing on, or in the case of TypeScript, the particular browser I might be testing with, but it's so that I'll be able to run in multiple browsers. In TypeScript, we organize by modules, and we can import those modules for use. And we can import down to like an individual artifact out of a module, so we don't want to necessarily pollute everything with everything in the RX module, right? So we can grab out a single operator or something. And so it gives us a nice fine granularity. In Groovy, we organize by packages, which you can import a package en masse, which means everything that's in this package will be available for import. Now, the meaning of the import is slightly different, but imports in the Groovy Java world are really there for developer convenience. But you've already committed to that dependency in some other way, so your footprint's already been established. It's not established by the import itself. You can also import individual artifacts from a package, but you cannot grab like all the sub-packages, like a whole tree of packages. So you get, if you do like import from com.foo.star, you get everything in com.foo.star, but you don't get everything in com.foo.bar.star. So it stops at one level. And there have been a lot of requests to allow sub-packages, but it hasn't happened yet. TypeScript gives us static typing, which allows excellent tooling support, but it's not actually required. You can still declare lots of stuff as any type, right? And then just is used as a general type. In Groovy, we also have static typing, but it's really it's not required, and it's often not enforced at compile time. And this is sometimes weird. Now, fortunately, the tooling is smart enough to say, hey, you cannot assign a cat to a dog, and you'll get a little warning in the IDE. And you'll say, I don't care. I'm going to assign cat to a dog. Now, the thing is, it'll work and it'll compile because the compiler is fairly forgiving. But you will be punished at runtime if you try to assign the cat to the dog. Just like in TypeScript, if you try to do something and then at runtime, it's going to like be missing fields or something, and it's like this is not, even though it seemed to compile all right, it's not actually going to work. In Groovy, we have a def type, which is like deferred type. I'm not going to specify what the type is here. It's just deferred. There's a general java.lang. And when I say dots, I'm talking about packages. So Java is a package. .lang is a package inside of the Java package. .object is a general type equivalent to any. In TypeScript, we declare things with the variable colon and the type. In Groovy, we declare with the type and then the variable, which is like a typical C language kind of thing. Java does it, C does it, Groovy does it. We have fat arrow functions in TypeScript, so I have some method, and I can then have an argument that expects this function, and I can use this fat arrow function that has a parameters with types if I want. And Groovy has an equivalent of closures, and they're declared like this, and so I can declare some method that takes a closure in. And if the closure is the last parameter, I can pull it outside of the prints on the invocation. We'll see that here in a second. So here's some here's an example closure in Groovy. So I have some method, and it takes a string variable argument, and it also takes a closure as an argument. And all it does in the method itself is it calls this closure and passes the variable that was passed. And so I call it like this: some method, hey, pass in hello, and then I can pass the closure. And if the closure is the last argument of the method, I can pull the closure out of the method, and now it kind of looks like a method body, right? And so here I'm just getting a string X, and then I uppercase it, lowercase it, reverse and uppercase it, and then we get that output. So closures, fat arrow functions, they should feel fairly, you should feel fairly comfortable in those comparisons. Now in the object-oriented comparisons, they're even more strikingly similar, because we have classes and interfaces and abstract classes in TypeScript and Groovy. We have enums in TypeScript and Groovy, but the enums in TypeScript are a bit different than enums in Groovy. The visibility modifiers, so you probably used private before, and you probably used protected even, and public. And there's mixins in TypeScript, and there are mixins in Groovy. And the mixins in TypeScript are actually a little more flexible than the mixins in Groovy, but we have something in Groovy to kind of take care of that called a trait, and we'll see that in a second. So here's a class. Now, I know this is very noisy, and I'm intentionally making it noisy to make the point. So if I want getters and setters in my class, I can define, I could have defined those all as private, right, which I should have, but for slide purposes, I didn't put the private word in front of each one of those. And then I can have a get method and a set method, and basically assign or mutate or access those fields. In Groovy, we define the class and we define the fields. But what about the getters and setters? Well, you automatically get getters and setters, and all the fields are automatically private by default. They're only accessible through the getters and setters. But they're directly accessible, so when you look at the code, it looks like I'm accessing the field directly, like I would say, X dot first name or X dot last name. And it looks like I'm accessing the field, but really what I'm doing is calling the getter. That's how it gets compiled. And so I get basically all the benefits of what the TypeScript class has with getters and setters, and assuming those are private fields with private fields. I get all of that in Groovy, but I only have to declare the fields and the types. With abstract classes and interfaces, so we declare in TypeScript, we declare an interface. It has some kind of a method name, and it has some arguments of types, and it returns a value of a type. I'm still a little fuzzy on when you have to. I think TypeScript has relaxed the semicolon rules. I mean, when I was doing classic JavaScript stuff, I'd get bitten because I used a semicolon or I didn't use a semicolon. I find you generally don't have to use them, except if you're doing multiple statements on the line, but correct me if I'm wrong. And so we have this abstract person that has a constructor. Here we see the private, the visibility modifier, and then I have a couple of getters. And then we have an employee that extends person and implements hourly. And by implementing hourly, when I go to compile this, TypeScript's going to say, hey, you have to add a calculate wages method on there. And so that meets the signature of the interface. And so we do that. And that's how you do it in TypeScript. In Groovy, what does it look like? Hey, that's just about the same thing. There's a type called big decimal in Groovy, which allows arbitrarily amount of precision. And so you don't get floating point errors and stuff. And by default, floating point numbers are big decimals in Groovy. There's another type called double where you will get some round off errors and things. But generally, big decimal is the type to use. We have an abstract class that's a person. We have an employee extends person and implements hourly. Same kind of deal. I have to implement that contract. If I don't implement the contract to the interface, Groovy is going to not compile. Any questions on that? It looks like, I mean, other than putting the type in front or in the back, it's like the same thing, right? So you ought to be able to like pick up and start doing OO stuff with Groovy right off the bat. Visibility modifiers. So they're pretty close to the same. The green indicates that they're pretty close to the same. So private in TypeScript means you can't access this field or this method outside of this class. That's what it means in Groovy. Kind of. I should put asterisks by all these for Groovy. And because Groovy is very patient. And so if you want to access another class's private field or private method, IntelliJ or IDE, the IDE will warn you that, hey, you're going beyond your privileges. But Groovy itself will not stop you. So just keep that in mind. You can do that, but generally it's there to kind of guide us, and the tooling helps tell us not to do that. But we violate it in different circumstances. We violate it all the time. Protected means something different in TypeScript. So in TypeScript, protected means I can see this field inside of my class, and any class that extends from my class can see it, and any class that inherits from my class. But that's it. In Java and Groovy, protected means that as well, but it also means any class that's inside the same package can see it, even if it doesn't inherit from it. So it's just a subtle, a little different. You get a little more visibility with the protected in Java and Groovy than you do in TypeScript. Public's the same. Default, yeah, so there's an asterisk here. What's the asterisk mean? Basically, with Groovy, I think I have a code example here. Oh, dang, did I leave it off? Oh, sorry, I might have left that slide off. So, oh no, it's right here. It's right in front of me. So public default, meaning no visibility modifier at all, has different meanings in Groovy and depending on the context. So at the class level, if I don't have anything in front of the class, right, and I would not generally have anything in front of the class, it's going to be default. It's going to be public. On the fields are private. Even though there's no visibility modifier there to say private, they are assumed to be private. But methods without a visibility modifier are assumed to be public. So methods are assumed to be public, fields are assumed to be private, the getters and setters are public, the ones that we don't see that get put in by the compiler. But any other method, if you don't put a visibility modifier, it appears to be public. So the default is a little weird. In fact, Groovy's kind of lost the default meaning from what Java has. And as a result of that, there's an annotation that you can put on that basically recover the default. But most of us don't feel like we've lost a lot. So we're OK with that. Any questions so far? Mixins. So I think this is kind of cool what TypeScript lets you do. So here I have an interface Barker, and I have an abstract class dog that implements Barker, and I have a breed that's a string type. And I'll go ahead and implement the wolf method here. And then this println probably won't work. Sorry, that was a Groovy thing. So, right. So the tailed class, it's a class. It's kind of interesting. And it has like a tail length and whether it's curly or not. And then there's a wag method on it that is implemented. Now, beagle extends dog. We get that, right? So we get whatever dog has, implements tail. So I get both the wag and the woof method, and I get those extra fields, and I'm implementing a class. Wow, that is really weird, but it's like I'm mixing in behavior and attributes from another class thing through this implement. I just uncovered that as I was building this talk, and I thought, that's kind of interesting. It's kind of powerful. Then I have this class Shiba Inu, which extends dog. Anyone knows what a Shiba Inu does, and it implements tail. And I set the tailed field to be curly is true, because that's true of Shiba Inus. And this is still valid at the end. I can have a mutt that implements beagle, you know, which is just some class out there. It's just really kind of mind-blowing how powerful that is. And I assume polymorphically, like the compiler is going to say, oh, you look like a beagle to me, so I'll let you, you know, be passed around as a beagle if you want. So in Groovy, it's a little different. Same thing with interfaces, same thing with abstract classes. We can't mix a class in as a mixin. So we have this thing called a trait. It's like the keyword class or enum, but it's a word trait. It's just added about like Groovy 2.0 or something like that. And trait looks a lot like that other class, right, that we saw in the TypeScript. Now I can say class beagle, sorry for the casing there, extends dog, implements tailed, and we can implement this trait. And when we implement the trait in Groovy, we get the fields, we get the attributes, and we get the methods of the trait. So it's a mixin, proper like the other. And polymorphically, it looks like, you know, if I pass the beagle object around in the system, I could pass it into an argument that's expecting a tailed object, and it polymorphically passes as a tail because it implements tail. But we cannot do this at the bottom, right? This we could do in TypeScript. Class mutt implements beagle. Well, beagle is a class, and classes in Groovy cannot implement other classes. I could extend from beagle, but we might not want to do that. Traits are a much more flexible way to kind of mix in together. Okay, any questions on that so far? That's sort of a high-level overview of Groovy, some of the syntactical and semantic differences. So I want to talk now about Grails. As I mentioned, Grails is a web framework that it started out as a web framework. It's way more than a web framework now. It's and sometimes, in some ways, it's way less than a web framework. Classic web frameworks were big, heavyweight things like think struts or Spring MVC or Java server faces that handle all aspects of the application. It has controllers to mediate between the view and the model, right? The model being services and databases. It has views, so like struts has its own views, right? And Spring MVC has its own view things, and they typically have custom tags and things that go into an HTML page, you know, a special kind of a page. Grails started out with a thing called GSPs, which are Groovy server pages or Grails server pages. I'm not sure what the G is there, but these were really heavyweight, and nobody, unless you were doing Grails stuff, nobody really understood what the tags were and anything else. But along the way, Grails shed its pure web framework personality, and it now implements various personalities based on the profile that you select. One of the more common profiles today is just a REST API profile. It has no view, no dedicated view at all. It just serves up content in JSON views, sort of a way to structure the JSON on the way out. but it has nothing to do with markup. It's just how to sort of package the data for sending back. And so you would provide the Vue technology would be an Angular framework or a React or something like that on a completely separate project. There are other, besides web and REST API, there are other profiles, and we can talk about those. Now, besides the web stuff, Grails has always been built on Spring since like the earliest days, and it's pretty much always used Hibernate. Anybody here not know what Hibernate is? Never heard of it? No idea what it does? Anyone want to know what it does? All right. It's an ORM, Object Relational Mapper. Over here I have a person class. Over here I have a person table. Somehow I have to get that class representation of all the data in the fields and the attributes of that object, of that class type, into the table. And when I query the database, I need to bring the data out of the database, pass it through this ORM layer, and end up again with a class, an object of a class type. And so ORM is this mediation between these two really disparate worlds. And so Hibernate came up for doing handling this problem in the SQL world. So like Hibernate knows how to structure queries for different dialects of database. So if you use an Oracle database, it knows how to tune an Oracle database query to be most effective. And if you use a Microsoft SQL Server, it knows how to make an effective SQL Server. And because there are tens of thousands of developers using Hibernate every day, if they have a problem in a query, it's, like in the way they structure a query, not a particular implementation of a query, but like how Hibernate generates, Oracle queries or SQL Server queries or whatever, those issues get surfaced right away and get fixed. So it's a really solid platform for doing SQL type work. But what it allows us as object-oriented developers to do is stay at the abstraction level of classes and objects. And we're not thinking of low-level tables and rows and indexes and things like that. We get those set up sort of through configuration and through initial creation of the schema, perhaps. But after that, we just think in object terms, and we pass our objects through the ORM layer into the database. So Grails has always supported Hibernate. It's really a pretty robust and well understood. It solves lots of interesting problems, how to handle optimistic locking, how to handle transaction kind of things. Spring also contributes to transaction management. Quartz is a scheduling framework, so you can schedule jobs, and you can go look at queues on every 2 minutes for polling or check for various states or whatever. Anything to do with scheduling, Quartz is in there for that. I'm not sure if it's a part of the core anymore, but it's certainly a popular plugin for Grails still. Now, Grails is built out of Groovy. It has a few Java parts, but most of it is Groovy. And Groovy is a close sibling to Java, and so Groovy still uses the JDK. So when we compile, what if I have a Java class that wants to talk, a Java object that wants to get data out of a Groovy object, or a Groovy object that wants to get data out of a Java object. So these get compiled, the Java stuff gets compiled. There's a joint compiler where we'll compile both the Groovy and the Java, but we're using the tooling in the JDK, and we're using the Java runtime, and we're using key elements of the Java language. All Groovy objects are also Java objects, meaning they inherit from one object class type called java.lang.object. And so every Groovy object type is also a Java object. And so it's really high degree of interoperability between Java and Groovy. What Groovy brings is a more fluent syntax. And the other thing it brings is the ability to do dynamic metaprogramming. So we can literally add behavior to an object or to a class at runtime that did not exist at compile time, which is very powerful, and it's leveraged quite a bit inside of Groovy. I would say that's becoming less less so because more and more things are being done at compile time, but there's still a lot of room for dynamic stuff. The dynamic stuff comes at a price, and the price is performance. And so Groovy in the beginning got a knock for being a slow performer because it's doing this dynamic method dispatch and trying to figure out, like, is this a method already part of the class, or is it dynamically added, at runtime? And it has this whole flow chart that it goes through. There's a new annotation in Groovy called compile static. And basically, if you know you're not doing any of that dynamic meta programming stuff in this method, you can tag the method as compile static, and then it basically strips out the dynamic method dispatch, and you get the same performance as you get with Java. There's no, in fact, I've seen it where it runs faster than Java for reasons I don't fully understand. And all of this sits on top of the Java virtual machine. And the JVM is what allows a Grails app written on my Mac to run on your Windows server, or to run on a Linux server out on AWS, or to run on IBM mainframe, or even in a specialized way to run as an Android app. If I write an Android app in Java, it gets compiled down to a special VM for Android. And so that's the parts. That's the architecture overall of Grails. It's fairly old architecture, but most of it still holds together. There are some key features about Grails that when you get in to start studying Grails, you'll want to pay attention to those. One is Grails enforces a model view controller architecture. It's hard to believe, but we did some crazy stuff back when you all were real small children. Back in the earliest days of Java and Microsoft ASP.NET, we would do database queries inside of our web pages, inside of our JSPs, and inside of our ASP pages. Just ridiculously stupid, unmaintainable, bad stuff. And Grails and Spring MVC and all these things that use MVC, and MVC is not, by the way, new. It was actually introduced in a Smalltalk paper in 1988, so it's been around a long time. But we didn't adhere to any of that in the earliest days of server-side web development. And so MVC says, no, there's a role for controllers to play, basically to mediate between views and the model. There's a role for the model. The model shouldn't know anything about the view. There's a role for the view. It shouldn't know anything about the structure of your database tables or anything else. It's, we keep these areas of separation, and it's much more maintainable. And Grails enforces this. Grails is built on Spring Boot, which is a very powerful concept. Spring is a framework, primarily a server-side framework that's used. And then it evolved a few years ago into something called Spring Boot. And Spring Boot has many advantages. We'll talk a little bit about those in just a few minutes. There's some convention over configuration is the general philosophy of Grails. If we can just have Grails behave in a certain well-understood way without you having to write code, or add a lot of additional configuration to get things set up, Grails will do that. There's this GORM. Remember, ORM is hibernate, right? Object relational mapping. Well, GORM started with that, and so it uses hibernate, and so GORM is like Grails ORM, right? And it's morphed and evolved. So now GORM, you can actually run GORM in Groovy standalone. You don't even have to have it inside of Grails. It still relies on some of the dynamic stuff of Groovy, so it needs Groovy, but it doesn't have to be in Grails. Well, it used to leverage hibernate. Now, when NoSQL came along, it was like, well, what are we going to use to write to Mongo? How are we going to write our stuff out to Redis? How are we going to do these NoSQL things, right? And Neo4j, right, or whatever. And so what Graham Roche, who's the lead dude on GORM and the founder of Grails, what he worked on was to build abstractions for GORM so that your domain object type, your class, your object that's going to be written out to a data store, can be written out to Mongo or to Hibernate or to Neo4j or to Redis. And so it's an abstraction higher than Hibernate. So if you're not using Hibernate, but you're using Mongo, you can still use Gorm or Mongo. It's just a different dependency you put in your graph. Now, some things don't make sense. In the SQL world, it's all about joining across tables, right? So the authors table joins, or the books table has a foreign key back to the authors table so that you can track what books which authors have written. In Mongo, there is no association. There's no joining to be done. So some things, like some of the query stuff for joining, just doesn't make as much sense. But he's taken it as far as I think you can do it. A relatively new thing that came out in the last few versions of Grails was JSON views. You know, you might have this big old fat domain object that has 50 fields, but on a particular page, I might only, like maybe I'm doing a list of them. I don't want to have a table that has 50 columns across, right? I mean, you just don't want to do that. And you don't want to, some of the columns you could say, well, let the view decide on that. But some of the columns you don't even want the view to see. For instance, there might be audit information, like who the last user was that updated the table. Well, unless you're like maintaining audit level information, maybe you don't even want that one to show. Or maybe the table in a particular view has, you're showing an employee record and you don't want to even make salary information available to the view so that it would inadvertently get shown. So you can write these JSON views to build a customized view of what the domain object should look like with fields named as you would like them to be named. So basically, the UI developers and the server-side developers build a contract and say, this is what the shape of the data is that's coming to me. And you build a JSON view that matches that. And you don't have to send all the data down. Or you might send a superset of data down. So maybe this piece of data doesn't even have a relationship to this other thing, but I want to include that in this view so there's not two trips to the server. And so you can build a JSON view where I have a more robust model available for the JSON view. And there are many plugins. Grails is fundamentally becoming more of a plugin architecture than in the beginning. Most of the stuff was in core, and then there were some plugins. Now, a small core center is in the Grails core. Everything else is done through plugins, and there are plugins for different security things. There are plugins for writing to Amazon S3. There are plugins for Quartz. There's plugins for all of these different kinds of things. And if you need something done, there's very likely to be a plugin available that does it. And because they're written in almost exactly the same way that regular Grails stuff is done, you could develop your own plugin if you're competent in Grails. You can develop your own plugin very easily. It has a very vibrant community. RGA here in town uses it. There was some work going on at Boeing. I mean, places all around the country use it. A lot of companies that you might not know about are using it. Some companies believe it's to their competitive advantage. If I could tell you like who we've done Grails training for, you would be like, oh, I didn't know they use Grails. But they don't advertise it because they see it as a competitive advantage to use it as opposed to another framework. So I mentioned Spring Boot advantages. So it's got really wide industry support. One of the nicest things that it did, and really critical in this day and age, is it produces a runnable jar. A jar, is the acronym JAR just stands for Java Archive. And what we used to have to do is we would build our Grails app that it would end up being one or more jar files. Those jar files would get bundled inside of a WAR file. And the WAR was a web archive, W-A-R. And that web archive would get deployed into a container. So you'd have a JBoss and you deploy it into JBoss. Or you'd have a WebSphere and you deploy it into WebSphere. Or you'd have Tomcat, you deploy it into Tomcat. But that means I had to stand up a container. And there's all kind of stuff around it. If you're working for an enterprise, you know how tedious it is to get a new environment set up and have to get this whole thing. What Spring Boot did really nicely is they put a Tomcat embedded server inside of the jar file. So now I can just have the jar, and I can run it as a jar file, and my application gets deployed inside of this embedded Tomcat. Why is that important? In the era of microservices and AWS, infrastructure as a service, now I don't have to go get a VM and install WebSphere or install Tomcat out there on AWS someplace and have this gigantic footprint in order to get this little 50K or 50 meg app rather deployed out. You'd have to deploy 500 megs worth of servlet container or whatever, JBoss container, in order to get a 50 meg app deployed. Now, you could run multiple apps in there, and that's typically what they did. But then as soon as that JBoss failed, what happened? All those apps that were deployed to it failed. You got knocked out. So this runnable jar, you can now deploy just that and then launch that. Also, who's used Docker in here? Any Docker users? Okay. So runnable jar, right? You build your Docker image. You say, hey, grab this jar from my file system, stick it in here. And when you run it with this command line. It's just like java-jar and then the jar name. And you just launch it from there. So now I can deploy this Docker container out and have my entire web, REST API server going out in this Docker container. So very powerful. The other thing is there are many libraries from Spring Boot. And there are these Spring Boot actuators. And I made this a link so I could actually show you what this looks like. So these are endpoints that you get for a Spring Boot app. And you can enable some of them and disable others. And I'll show some of them in operation later. But look what you get. You get I can see what the audit events are if I have audit events. Spring beans that are loaded. Various conditionals that happen during the configuration. Configuration properties. What my environment variables look like, the health of the system. And we use this all the time with health, right? You can have a monitoring thing that just is hitting your endpoint saying, are you up? Are you up? Are you up? And so every 30 seconds, are you up? Are you up? And if it goes down, you get event notifications right away because it's just pinging this really lightweight health endpoint. Info has some more information, like maybe the version of the jar that was deployed or the version of Grails or whatever you're using. What loggers, some liquid-based stuff, I won't go into that. Metrics, so you can decorate. There's a plugin for Grails. There's one, it's called, it's a Drop Wizard metrics, and I wrote one called Drop Wizard. I don't even remember. It was for another Drop Wizard thing to do a specialized reporting out on that. And you can annotate your classes and say, hey, whenever this method calls, increment the count, right? So you can do counters and gauges and whatever. Then the metrics can dump out and you can get these reports that say, this method was hit 50,000 times in the last 2 hours, or whatever. And you can detect, loads and DDoS type things or whatever you need to do, however you're going to consume it. Sessions that are available. There is actually a shutdown endpoint, which is disabled by default. You have to explicitly enable it, where you can literally shut your container down with through this endpoint. It's okay for testing and development, but you'd never use it otherwise. So those are the endpoints, and there's a ton of them. And there are a lot of other advantages, and there are tons of Spring Boot books out there. So by being built on Spring Boot, Grails gets to leverage a lot of that goodness. Some of the GORM advantages, I mentioned these databases that are in use. We have MongoDB is supported. We have Neo4j, Cassandra. I didn't even realize Cassandra was supported, but if you're not familiar with Cassandra, it's a distributed database, right? And so Netflix has something like 10,000 Cassandra instances. Don't quote me if you see this on YouTube, but that's what I heard. They have something like 10,000 Cassandra clusters, and one cluster's like a replication factor of 3, I think. So it's like 30,000 instances of these Cassandras. Because when you press pause or play or fast forward or whatever, every one of those little signals goes up and gets stored into Cassandra so that it knows that when you come back to watch, where you stopped watching the last time you watched. I heard a stat that said after 5 p.m. Eastern time in the US, something like 57% of all internet traffic is driven by Netflix. I'm not just saying Amazon traffic. I mean, like all internet, all the bytes moving on the internet, like after 5 p.m. Eastern, or like the majority of them have something to do with Netflix. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting to hear. Okay, some GORM data services are new, and GORM 6.1 is out. This is like the newest version. It features a thing called data service, a concept that adds the ability to generate implementations for Groovy interfaces using conventions that GORM developers are already familiar with, and you'll be familiar with them too when I show them. They're so easy. Here's a book service. Notice it's an interface. It's got a couple of annotations. It says, hey, this is a service for a domain type called book. So there's going to be some book fields, right, that are involved. This Grails also supports multi-tenancy. So if you're like working for a company that's doing SaaS or something where multiple clients come up and they're on your database, GORM will actually automatically segment the data in such a way that one customer can't see the other customer's data because they'll put it into a different database or a different schema. In some way, it segregates it off. But this just says whoever the current tenant is, this book service is going to serve them. And look what the methods are. Find me this book for this ID, or find me a list of books with some arguments to count how many books I have, save this book or update this book or delete this book, given some data, okay? These method names here, there's a certain convention. So if you have count star, then you'll get the count of, you know, whatever you're specifying. I can say count by some dynamic thing, and like count by every book that's in there that's over 500 pages but less than 22 pages or something like that. There's a whole thing here. Delete star. There's find methods, get methods, list methods, or retrieve methods. They all basically do a query for this thing. There's find by, which gets you one of them, right? Or find all by, which gets you all of them that matches certain criteria for the dynamic finders. Save, stores, and persist, and then updates. And notice, I should have pointed this out in the slide. So you can do this synchronously, blocking, or you can do this using RxJava, and you get back an observable. Is anybody playing around with Angular 5 or Angular 2.x and using observables now instead of the promises as before? So these are the same observables because it's all coming from the same RxJava, RxJavaScript world. And so if you know how to work with observables in Angular, you're going to feel comfortable working with the observables in Born. Some concrete examples. So here we have the book service, and I have find books, and I have a title and some args. A map is just, in JavaScript terms, it's just like an object of generic type, right? And it just has some key value pairs. And so here we have, I'm going to find a book with the title called The Stand, and I'm going to only bring back, I'm going to offset by 10 records, and I'm going to bring back a max of 10 records. I want to sort by title and order by description. Well, there's probably only one book on The Stand, so that's probably not a great example, but I could have used, I could have used a more fuzzy match and gotten a whole collection of them. Here we see a service for a book that is going to find by title and publish date greater than, and so I give a title and then I give a date, and then I'm going to find all published dates that are greater than the date I supplied. But I'm not writing the implementation for this. I just write it in the interface, and GORM will, under the covers, make a concrete class that does the implementation for this. And it will write the Hibernate query if it's a Hibernate, or it'll write the Mongo collection query if it's Mongo, or whichever database you're using. And so we see down below at the last one, we see a book service, and we have a find, and we have a find another. And notice the find does a join with the author, and which is probably an outer join. And then find another does a join with the author, but it's saying I want a left outer join. And so the difference between left and right is whether you're going to get back, nulls, left or outer. Either the first one is like a pure intersection. If you don't have a match with the author, you're going to get nothing. The second one, I'm going to get the authors or the books, whether they have a join or not. And so I'll get the book even if there's not a matching author. So I think that's how the left outer join works. Okay, so I want to do a couple of demos. First, Grails only as a REST server. And I'm going to just walk through this one, actually, because it's pretty basic. But I want to show you how easy it is. And then we'll look at Grails Angular 4 with scaffolding and then Grails Angular 5 with custom app. I do a create app. Now, all of this is comments. There's only one line of bash code here. But I was telling you about the profiles. Here's all the profiles you get. Angular is what we would probably use here, right? Angular 5 is what you're going to get today. When Angular 6 comes out, we'll update the profile. We'll have Angular 6 as the current one. REST API is just a pure REST API server. Base profile, which is just kind of a concrete profile for other profiles to extend from. You can get an Angular JS, a classic Angular profile. You can say, I'm going to make a plugin. You can specify a profile for creating new profiles, so it's very meta. React, and so we're not probably React people here, but if we were React people, there's a React profile. There's a Webpack profile, so if your UI framework is using Webpack, but it's not specified otherwise here, you can use that. The web profile, the classic one that you get, the one that you'll get if you don't specify a profile, you'll get web. I'm almost thinking we ought to change that to where you get REST API, because that is going to be by far the more common use case. REST API, there's a Vue plugin now, a Vue profile. So if you've heard of Vue, I mean, it's actually a very interesting UI framework. We have some really smart UI people working on the Grails team, and they stay on top of this stuff. And when something really interesting comes along, they're right at it, and they're trying to make a plugin for it. If you're making web for JBoss, there's some special stuff you do when you deploy to JBoss, and then there's a plugin for web applications.
What's JBoss?
JBoss is Enterprise Application Server, a JEE, Java Enterprise Edition server. It was one of the first ones set up by Mark Fleury back in the days. I invited Mark when I ran a Java user group here in town. I invited him to speak, and then the room was packed. You might have been there, Doc. We had 150 people come down to our meeting facility because it was such a big thing. It was like the open source answer to, like BEA Web Logic and some of the commercial things that were very expensive. This thing was free and open source. You literally just go download a zip file and you could have your JBoss server up. I mean, it was so disruptive what he did. I think they ended up getting bought. I'm not sure if they got bought by BEA, no, they probably got bought by Oracle. But anyway, it's still kicking, although JEE is kind of fallen out of favor from lighter weight. JEE does not fit a microservice architecture very well at all, right? Because I got this 20 meg app that I need to deploy, 1 gig of footprint to get my JEE server running. And it's just like, that just doesn't even make economic sense. So let's look at so that's how you create it. And I'm not going to say much more because we'll have a little demo where we're using the rest anyway. I'm going to do the Grails Angular 4 scaffolding demo here. So hopefully I'm still sharing the screen out, and we'll bring up that. So this is a scaffolding demo. So there's this boot run. I'll go over some of the Grails structure, but this is a multi-project Uber project. There's a client, which is Angular, this Angular 4 something. I think that's where the scaffolding is today. And there's the Grails REST API server. And I can start them both up in this boot run task. So Grails is built for the build system, uses Gradle, which is written in Groovy. And boot run is a task that you say basically to the build system, hey, I want you to run this bootable thing that we have. And that comes from Spring Boot. And so now we see at the bottom, we see that localhost 4200 is up for the Angular part. And there's some warnings here because there's a circular dependency, but which there is. This is a simple author books model. The authors have reference to all the books that they wrote, and each book reference knows who the author was, who the lead author was. So let's just go here and see what we get. So this scaffolding, I'm going to walk you through the slides to create this, but I'll do the demo first. So here, this is what you get as sort of your index page, and obviously you're free to replace it once. Scaffolding is like a one-time code generation step, and you make your domain object, then you say, I want to scaffold the views for it, and then you get the views. But the only code I wrote, and actually I have to show that, the only code that I had to write was here in the domain. That's my authors, and let me make that bigger. That's my authors. Notice an author has many books. This is Grails syntax here for a domain class. Here's a book. A book belongs to a lead author. So I didn't want to do a many-to-many association because it's a little complicated and doesn't get represented in the scaffolding well. Actually, I don't even think it supports many-to-many yet. So you have to generally, if you're using scaffolding, decompose into 2 one-to-manys, and I didn't want to go to the complication for this demo. So what do we have? Here's that. So let's look at author. I think it's author. So here's author. I did not write this view. This view was generated automatically, generated off of the data that was available in the domain class. The only code I wrote were the 2 domain classes I just showed you. So I want to do a new author. Because of the constraints that are in there, I said the first name, last name, and email address are required, but middle name is not. And notice I get the field highlighting. So if I put in my name and my real email address, feel free to email me, particularly if you want to send me PayPal money. What happens? I do a save. Now it's been saved. Notice it's not editable anymore. I can go back to my author list and I see that. Now I can go back in and edit it, and I can say, you know, change something if I want, or I can just go over to the book view. Now I don't have any books yet, so I'll write a book here. Let's call it Angular plus Grails. I have to emphasize, I did not create these views. I did not do any of this stuff. I wrote 2 domain classes, and that one line of code that installed the Grails. And then I ran a scaffolding. We'll see the command that run the scaffolding to do the generation. And also, it's not a very friendly thing to put in here, but it sort of tells me what my ID field is here. Scaffolding is not really meant to be your production app. It's meant to get you up to speed so you can kind of see how your different domains work together and how they're associated and whatever. And then you come back and you really replace it with the rich UI. Here's my book list. All right, let's go look at the authors. Here's my author list. Now notice I have some books. If I click on the link on here, or if I go into it and I click on the link inside of here, I get to the books. So I have this whole sort of 2-directional. I can do a delete. You know, if you want to see me delete it, I will. Here's a delete. Oh, actually, yeah, I'll delete just the book. So I'll delete this. Book is gone. Let's go back to the authors. And we see the author's still there, but the book is gone. If I added the book, because the book belongs to the author, if I delete the author, there will be a cascade delete and all the author's books will be deleted. That may or may not be what you want. And there's ways to configure the domain so that it doesn't do a cascade delete. But then it would become orphaned, right? So, or you might have it assigned to, like, you know, a bullpen author or something like that. And that happens all the time. Okay, so that's that. Let me come back here and show you some of the guts of this. Those are the 3 commands I used to get this app started. First, I did a create app for scaffolding demo. I said the profile I want to use. Now here, I'm using the latest version of Grails, but I had to go back to an older version of the scaffolding plugin, 4.10, because it doesn't support the 5.0 yet. And the new version of Grails, if you did the Angular profile, you'd get Angular 5, and the scaffolding wouldn't work with it. So this is just what I had to do for this. The 4.10 is not the Angular version, it's the plugin version. Then I changed to the scaffolding demo directory because it creates a subdirectory and where the projects live and the client and the server. I changed to the client, and then I downloaded the internet like we're all used to doing. And so this loads up all the dependencies and node modules, and we're off to the races. I created that author's domain class, has some fields. First, cannot be blank. Last name, blank, cannot be blank. All fields are not nullable by default, but the question is, could I put an empty string in there? And if I say no blanks, it will not pass the validation. Middle name, I said, it's okay if it's null. And then email address has to be an email. So if I put something besides the email address in, it would fail validation. Like not meaning a valid email, but like just the structure of an email address. And there's the constraints, there's like 30 constraints or more. There's regex matching. You can do just really powerful constraints. That's all you got to do. For the author, here's the book. Oh, the relational part here is the static has many says I'm going to be associated with this list of books over here. And this list of books or this set of books over here, they have a title, a copyright year. It belongs to this author. So if I delete the author, I'll delete the book. And that could happen. You get signed on a contract to write your new Angular plus Grails book, and you run out of steam, and I just can't write it. I don't have enough time. They cancel the contract. They remove me as their author contract employee person, and my book disappears as well. All right? The constraints here. Notice the constraint here. I say copyright year. The max year can only be this year. So like I can't say that the copyright year is 2020 because 2020 hasn't happened yet. So we can't say it has copyright. All right? A little bit of config. I'm not even sure if this is still required, but it probably was at the time of the scaffolding, is you got to make sure that when dates are passed back and forth between the Angular world and the Grails world, that the format aligns with this internet date format thing. You guys are all familiar with that. So we just add that. That's the only config I had to do was add that little piece of config in there. And I didn't even use the date. I probably could have not done it. I generate the scaffolding, Grails. ng, I'm inside the client app, by the way, the client module. Grails, ng generate all, demo.author. Demo is the package, author is the domain class, .author. True means override anything that's already there. Because during development, you might override it a bunch of times while you're getting it right. And so I overwrite the author, I overwrite the book, it generates all the UI. I did not write one line of UI code, and it's all in there. And if you want to look at it, and we have some time, we can look at the code itself. Then I ran it. Yeah, don't expect to memorize all this. The important thing is I ran a Gradle task, Gradle W, boot run, -- parallel. That's what I did it from the idea. It does the compiles, it makes everything, ensures everything is okay, gives me some warnings about those circular dependencies, and then I'm up and running. I get this home screen, as we saw. By the way, if I clicked on I kept typing in author on the web address, but I could have just as easily gone back to the home page and clicked on the author controller or the book controller, and I would have gone to the same page. There's the author list, empty. I create an author, I create a book. I have an author and a book. Here I had 2 books in. I had a second book that I had done. Now I want to show you, because I set up the Grails REST API, this is using Postman. Anybody use Postman for like testing or what? Yeah, it's a great tool, right? And so this is Postman. I just hit the author's endpoint. Where did that authors come from? Remember when I did the domain class back here, it's URI equals /authors. That's how I defined what that URI was, that REST API endpoint was going to be. So I do that. Oops, sorry. And then I get the author back. Notice I get the author and I get the books, and it's an array of books, but I only get the IDs here, right? You can structure a JSON view that you'll have more data in there. And this is a scaffolding demo, and you only get the IDs. But in a real app, you could say, oh no, I want the whole author name and everything because I don't want to make another call with that ID to go back and get the book information. Here's the book via API call. Pretty similar. It's a GET post, but it's a GET, and then notice the ID is on the end of the URI. Here's a post, and so the top half is what I'm posting to it. So it's my Angular plus Grails 2nd edition book, and I'm still the author on it. And then after I get it back, I get a 201 created, which we expect from our REST server, and there's the ID now come back to me, so now I can keep that locally and use it as needed in the UI. I can list all the books that are now out, and I have 2 books available. That's that. That's scaffolding. What did I write? I did a few commands to kind of get it started and then generate, and then I wrote the 2 domain classes, put @resource tags on them, and then wrote issued the ng generate all to generate the UI stuff. And I have a full CRUD administration app. You could you could use this for a back office thing if you like keeping track of software licenses or whatever. You could have it up and running in an hour's time. You could have, whatever you're trying to keep track of, licenses or whatever. Any questions? Let's see a different app that is more custom and more was harder work for me to do because Angular being new to me. So first, I want to make sure I come in here and kill this process. Can't tell you how many times I've done a demo where I've started a server one time and forgot about it, and then I come over to run it, and then I start getting errors because of port bind errors and all this. It's like, oh, what have I done? So here we go. In this app, I have a Grails Angular project. Notice I'm going to run parallel again. And we get about the same thing. I'm running this from inside of IDEA, so we'll see about the same thing. Here's the 4200 and the 8080. Oh, it hadn't compiled yet, actually. So here we go. I see there's some controllers here, a catalog controller, a publisher controller. But I actually am going to step aside. So here's this like Grails this way. And if I wanted to do CRUD kind of stuff, I could do that through those controller endpoints. I'm not going to do that here. Instead, I have a whole demo, TypeScript. I called it TS demo. I don't know why, because it's really Angular 5. And so I am going to show you pretty close to the limit of my understanding of Angular with this app. So just bear with me. This uses a material. This is a material card. I show some publishers. I'll show you where I have the data, but it's bootstrap data on the server. It's in a real database. It's in an H2 in-memory database. So everything I do is driven from the database, but it's just in memory. I didn't set up Oracle or something, Postgres or MySQL to deal with it. So here I have an A-Press and Manning authors. These are not real people. I hope I gave them fictitious enough names. You won't try to email them with your book proposal. There might be a William Goodreads there and a Jane Fast Reader, but I hope not. All right, so there we go. So you see the little animation effect here. So this is the material. So I've made a little progress as a nascent Angular guy. So here I'm looking at A-Press. Now, when I switch publishers, I make a database query, and we can see that. If I do that, we see that I call catalog /publisher /2. I call the catalog publisher 2 change, and that's through the catalog service. And so we are indeed making actual calls. And so here I have an Angular book. This is a table, and I don't do support deletes because almost every project I've ever worked on, they do not like the idea of deleting data, particularly if it's a regulated industry. So what you can do is tag the data as being inactive or archived or whatever. But sometimes you still want to see it. If there was any, I would come up here and click this include. Well, in fact, let's make this one. Let's take Adam Freeman's ebook and let's make it inactive. I can get your advice on, like I have this dialogue, which is nice enough, but no matter what I do, the CSS, I cannot get the form to fill the whole dialogue. And I have done everything I can think of. I'm sure it's a stupid oversight on my part. And if you know, email me and you'll get some swag. Okay, so let's take this. Let's just make his inactive and update it. Boom, it's gone. That inactive went to the database, updated it to be inactive, and then did a new load of the data because I don't know, other users might have made other things inactive, and I know I'm seeing what the fresh state is. But I do have it, but it's inactive. And so this is just filtering. So I click that and I just change a filtering of the collection I'm viewing for the table, but I'm not making another database call. If I do an add, so this is my Angular plus Grails book I was talking about, and my ISBN, I'll put a temporary placeholder. I have a little TBD image there. I think my book will be worth every bit of 99 cents on Amazon Kindle, and it will be an ebook, and I'll be the guy. So there you go. I'll do the add. That made a database post call. I get the TBD. It's in there. It's live. and we can see that all the data is indeed there. If I switch to Manning, so I have some Manning books, 3 decent books. I love Manning books, and they have a early access program book there. The print versions, also, the same 3 books are in print. Manning also has videos, which are interesting. They have a Spark in Motion and GraphQL in Motion, which I've thought about buying. Now, I wonder if Apress has a video. So when I go to Apress, I stay on the same selected tab, but they have none to look at. So this is a basic structure. It uses Grails REST API. It uses the client. I'll walk through some code. We can look at the code live, but I think for time purposes, I'm going to go through the slides because I captured sort of some of the most important part of the slides. If I minimize that window, does it stop screen sharing or not? Okay. So notice here I didn't specify because I'm not using the scaffolding, so I'm using the latest, greatest Angular that is supported by the profile, which is Angular 5. When you do Grails, sorry, let me get rid of that blocks down there and maximize it. So this is what you get. So notice I have a client and a server, and then I have, like the Gradle build file stuff and some dependencies that are specified in the Gradle are in those external libraries. When we look at the client part of this, we see that everything you'd expect in a client app for an Angular app, right? I get, I have a source tree, E2E. We have our package JSON with the lock file. We have protector, the lint files, yarn lock file, etc. Multi-server for the server. This is the structure I was talking about. Notice inside of this Grails app directory, notice a directory called controllers, and another directory called domain, and another, which is like my model, like my domain model, right? And another one for services. This enforces that MVC pattern I was telling you about. You put your controller stuff in the controller directory, you put your domain stuff in the domain directory, and you put your services in the services directory. And then there's another source tree that you can put general utility classes and things that are not, controllers, etc. We saw this at work. I could have showed you I did show the ad. So there we go. We did the whole demo. We added one. This is the publisher. Now, there's another concept besides database relationship. There's another kind of relationship called an embedded relationship. And this is just where I have some fields over in this class. And I want to, when I write these to the database, I just want to include all those fields in the same record for publisher. So there's a person contact, and I put that contact into the database. There's 2 ways to define this, and I define it this way, where I just define it as a field, and then I give the name of the field as the embedded. The publisher controller. So this is a Grails controller. Notice I extend RESTful controller. Remember in the scaffolding, I just put the @resource annotation on the domain. Well, here I want to add some more flavor to the controller. So I added a whole new endpoint called the catalog action here, and we'll see it how we document that. And I call out to the catalog service. Just like Angular supports dependency injection by declaring a field going into the constructor, Grails will automatically inject the catalog service into this publisher controller when it's instantiated. I'll use that service to actually load the publisher catalog, and we'll look at it in a minute. I've said the only response format I'm going to support is JSON, which is perfectly reasonable nowadays, but some legacy consumers might need XML. I could still give them XML if I needed to. Here's what we have a special file in Grails called URL mappings, and here we have a bunch of sort of REST type methods. If you're going to call with a delete action or the delete method or the get method, where I'm going to call with a controller or a controller with an ID, or post method or put or patch, and then we call a particular controller. So you name the controller. This is how I would do the CRUD stuff, right? This is how the scaffolding stuff works. It's like, oh, I'm going to add a new book. I'll call the post method on the /books URI, and that tells me that it's going to go in, or the /book, and it'll go into the book controller, and then it'll add it'll call the save method to do that. Here's the one I added, /publisher / $publisher ID, meaning give me the ID, which is like the primary key in this case, and the catalog /catalog. And this just gives enough context that it will go to the catalog here. Since publisher was a controller, I didn't want publisher ID, controller and ID to mismatch one of the ones above, so I gave this one some special naming. And that produces a new endpoint. Here's that catalog service. The catalog service, I said in general, is transactional, because I would anticipate I'm going to add stuff to it. I'm going to do whatever. It turns out I'm not using the service for that. I'm just going to go fetch some stuff. So that particular method is not transactional. This query here is called a GORM where query. And this just says, go find the catalog item where the publisher ID in the catalog item matches the publisher ID that was passed in. That's it. And I couldn't have gotten here if you didn't give me a publisher ID, because with that URL mapping, I would have gotten 404. So if you give me an ID, like a number, I expect to be able to come in here and do that. And then the dot list. So the where produces in Hibernate terms what's called a detached query, a detached criteria query. So it's just basically something you can store or pass around and reuse. But as soon as you call dot list on it, it actually invokes it and does the query. Here's the catalog item, a little more populated with a few more fields. Notice it belongs to publisher. I don't know if we saw that on the publisher. But on the publisher, so I modeled this so that the publisher does not have a list of books, because I get them through that catalog endpoint. And the reason the publisher doesn't have the list of books is if I delete a publisher, I don't necessarily want to delete all the books. So I don't want that cascading issue. So this is called a unidirectional one-to-many. And so the publisher doesn't really keep a list of books. The other thing is it's very rare that I would want to download Manning and get their entire library of every Manning book ever produced in the history of Manning. That'd be hundreds of thousands of records probably. I don't want to do that. So publisher doesn't even have that association. But it's enough that the catalog item has the association that says I do belong to this publisher. Okay. Here's the controller. Notice I don't do anything special here, but I did add XML here. So if I wanted to produce XML, I could produce XML. Here's what the person, remember on publisher, it had a publisher name and it had a contact and it was of type person that I'm embedding. A key feature I want to point out here is, notice that validatable, implements validatable. What this says for Grails is I can use that same constraints, static constraints block to validate domain types, and so I can make sure that you're providing me, when you provide a person, that you're providing, and this person is part of the fields for going into the database, I can ensure that the first name is not blank and the last name is not blank, and that the email, actually I think email true is enough, but I put blank false as well. And then also I put a little helper method here, and one thing I didn't mention about Groovy, if you name a method get whatever, get X, then I can reference X as though it were a field. So in this case, it's get full name. So if I have a person object, say person object P, I can just call P.fullName. And what really happens is it calls the get full name, which will then concatenate the first and last. Okay? So the getters are really powerful. It looks like fields, but it's really getter access. There's a media type enum. I mentioned way earlier that TypeScript enums and Groovy Java enums are different, and they are. Java and Groovy enums, JVM enum types, have two characteristics out of the box. They have an ordinal value, which starts at 0, but you can override that. So this one, the ebook is ordinal 0. P is ordinal 1, and video is ordinal 2. Just like in TypeScript, right? If you give it a name, then you get the number. The mistake I think the TypeScript implementation does for enums is it defaults to that number for passing back and forth. And so, what will happen, right? When you insert a new enum, your ordinal numbers are going to get all shift. So if you looked at the code and we'll see it here in a second for the TypeScript enum, I don't use just the name. I use the name equals a string because I only want to persist that string and pass the string back and forth. And then inside of Grails, the other, besides ordinal, is I have the name of the thing, which looks just like that. If it's all uppercase, the name is all uppercase. Here's the publisher component, which is now in the client. Is there anything interesting in here? There's a lot of interesting stuff, and I'll make this it's all on a GitHub repo. I'll make the link available to the meetup group. But a couple of interesting things is I used a selection model. So when I select between publishers, I keep track of that with this selection model. The other thing is on publisher service, we'll see publisher service in a second, but I can load the publishers from that. And yeah, okay, so that's what we're doing here. And then when I select the publisher, I can go to the publisher service and I can do a change publisher. I'm using a behavioral subject over there. Anybody use that in Angular before? Ever see a So behavioral subject is like something that you could say, hey, I got lots of different components that might be interested in the change of publisher. So let them all subscribe to it. And then whenever someone issues this change to change the publisher, like you clicked on the new publisher, it'll get broadcast to everybody. And that way you're not like having to worry about parent-child relationships and whether it's a sibling or whether it's a great-grandparent I'm trying to pass data to. Whoever cares about publisher changes subscribes to this, and whenever the publisher changes, everybody gets notified. I thought that was actually pretty cool. That's how I did. In fact, here we see it. So new behavioral subject of type publisher. I'm not passing in an initial value, and then I set that to a source. And then I make a field called selected publisher, and I set it as an observable. Back here, I just said, you know what, I might have left that line off of here. This one may not actually subscribe to it because it already knows where it is, but we'll see it in a second. And then, you know, whenever I load up the publishers, the other interesting thing here is I'm using the HTTP client, which is, by the way, what broke in the scaffolding, or from 4 to 5, because they switched from HTTP to HTTP client, and so map is not a function and blah, blah, just all kinds of breakage between 4 and 5 on Angular. But notice what I do here is I subscribe, I go to HTTP, and then I get it back in observable. I subscribe to that, and then I just add to the list of publishers that I have, and I return that list. Here's the catalog component. A little more interesting. Notice down here, this is that subscription. This .publisher service .selected publisher. That's that field that I said would be as observable. And then I say subscribe to that observable. And whenever there's a publisher change, just set my publisher field to be updated to whatever the publisher change was. So I get this notification. This catalog component doesn't have to get data passed to it from the parent, or you don't have to keep track of the component tree at all. This is just a complete asynchronous pub-sub type of event model. I just thought that was fairly useful. Some more stuff. When I do an add catalog item, I create the item, and and then this is in the dialog, and then the dialog has a submit action on it. And when it's submitted, I then trigger a change media type. That's the tabs. So electronic book, printed book, video. I do that because it will trigger a refresh of the filtering and everything that happens. Here's the catalog service itself. Again, I keep track of what the media source is, and I broadcast that out through this mechanism. When I save a catalog item, I return an observable. And so I use the put method for the save. What's interesting about put is, what's the semantics on put? I use a put and a post here, but I could have probably just gotten away with a put, because a put is if there's not an existing object, it'll create one, and the post will only create one, right? So I just check to see if I have an ID, because the ID is a sequence number on the database. If I have an ID, then it's an update, and if I don't have an ID, then it's a post. And I post it through, and that's how the database call happens. But notice I return from the save not the object itself, but an observable, because I don't know how long this HTTP action is going to take. Oh, you know what? I thought I had another slide.
Look what also return back the ID that's created.
Yeah, actually, I think you get the ID back. I think you get the whole field back both ways. You get the whole object back as the return. Yeah, the put semantics are that if there's not one, you get one created, and if there is one, then it'll just do the update. It'll replace the entire object. The patch semantics are that only the fields that you provided will get updated. But the put, you can just use the put for both post and put type operation, you know, insert and update operations.
There's actually no reason at all.
Well, I'm not going to say that because somebody will email me and say there is a reason to use post, but I'm just saying that you can use put, and the web behavior, the REST behavior is if one doesn't exist, it'll be created, and if one does exist, it'll get replaced. Okay, so all of this is on Git in operation. Not bad for a guy who only does server-side development. I mean, come on. But we have one last thing, and only this slide. I mentioned that because we produce a runnable jar, I am no longer required to stand up some big honking JBoss server or WebSphere server or some other gigantic enterprise edition thing to just run my little catalog service or whatever. I can produce a jar file, and I can, you can deploy that onto an EC2 instance directly, and you can just launch it when that instance starts up. I mean, that's how easy this is, right? You can specify on the command line like what ports you want to listen to. So you could put 2 or 3 of them on one server if you wanted. I mean, you have the failover issue. But you can also still produce a WAR file. So if you have a JBoss or a WebSphere sitting in the back that you're paying your $100,000 a year maintenance fee on, and you really want to get your money out of it, then produce a WAR file and it'll run as a WAR file. But because it's runnable as a jar file, it's a runnable jar with an embedded Tomcat server, I can now package that in a Docker container, store that off into Docker Hub or Amazon ECS repository, and then whenever I want to start up a new instance, it says go fetch that container and fetch that image and start running it from here. And now this is where microservices come in, because now I can have 50 instances of this thing running, and all I did was put out one Docker container, and I just spread the Docker container to 50 separate instances. And now if one of them goes down, you won't even know it. I mean, your users won't know it. You'll know it because there's monitoring that says, hey, instance number 32 is down. But you probably have resiliency baked in, and it'll just kill the instance and start a new one up. I mean, literally, this whole notion of PagerDuty and on-call and all that goes away once you have the flexibility to deploy 20 or 30 instances. And if you do canary deployments, where you deploy like a new feature, a new change into a very limited set of instances, or few number of containers, and you let just some of your prime beta testers or trusted customers hit it, then you can just monitor. And if you don't get reported problems after 4 years, or what, 4 years, after 4 years, if you don't get reported problems after 4 hours, you can start rolling that container out to the other instances, right? And you kill off the old one and start up the new ones and get back to your 50 Docker containers running. This is where high availability, resiliency, self-healing for software comes. What if issues do happen? Like you put out a new feature and it's throwing exceptions left and right, and there's timeouts. Your monitoring can see that and say, oh, wow, this is not working. Kill that and have the load balancer send everybody back to the old version until we figure out what's going on with it. So this is where self-healing and resiliency comes in. I do want to mention there was a recent announcement. If you were in Madrid last week, there is an announcement of a new product coming out. It's originating in the, sorry, I wanted to maximize that. So it's called Micronaut. It is a new microservice-oriented framework. It's built by the same folks that built Grails and the same brilliant minds in the form of Graham Roche and Jeff Scott Brown and James Clee, who did the Angular plugin. And this Micronaut, this is not the logo, but it's suitable for display. This Micronaut is microservice framework. Oh, sorry. And what it does, where it has some differentiators between Grails. You might have seen, even on this little local host thing that I started up, it took, what, 30 seconds to get the app started. Micronaut is still JVM based, so you get sort of all the features of the JVM, and there's too many I can talk about here, but the big thing is I can run it on different OSs transparently. It's a full stack framework for building modular, easily testable microservice applications. It's got monumental leap in startup time. Startup time is between 1/2 and 1.5 seconds for this server. It's very fast. It uses reactive, asynchronous programming model. It's got a very minimal footprint. I think the Java footprint for a basic Hello World app is 12 megabytes. Java is 12 megabytes. And if you use Groovy, it's 16 megabytes. We have all downloaded JPEG images bigger than 12 megabytes, I'm sure. So this thing is really fast, and it's built for microservices. So it's the whole idea is that I can deploy 100 of these things out with these small footprints, put them out on 100 different, or combined on, some number of EC2 instances, and have a massive network effective applications. It can produce Lambda applications, so you can run this thing inside of Lambda, because Lambda. Typical JVM startup times on Lambda really kill the Lambda is the Amazon Web Service serverless platform. And so if you wanted to run Lambda where there's no server at all, a request comes in and it gets serviced. If you use a traditional Spring Boot type app, you might be 20 seconds of startup time. This thing is up in a second, and you're paying by the 100 millisecond increment on Lambda. So if you can cut it from 20 seconds to 1 second to get your app started, you're saving yourself a lot of money. And then as soon as it's done, the Lambda goes away and you're not paying anything. So this is really made for that. The first milestone we think is coming in May. It's going to be open source, but it's not yet out in an open source repo because there's some of the legal requirements of getting the open source set up and the license and all that set. I think it's going to be, don't quote me, but I think it's Apache license, but it's a very generous license. I mean, there's like no, GNU type stuff. So it's either Apache or MIT, but I think it's Apache. First milestone in May, second milestone in June, into release in fourth quarter, GA release in fourth quarter this year. This thing is going to be killer, guys. I am telling you. It's taken all the stuff that we just saw in the rest for Grails, and it's skinnying it down to this essential element of server capability that you need for Lambdas or you need for a little REST type service or something. It's just really exciting, and I just want you to. It's called the website is micronaut.io. There's a subscription form I think on here somewhere. So sign up. Auto configuration dependency. It has automatic service discovery, because one of the problems is if I have 1,000 of these running, how do they know like what's up and how do I reach out to you to get the service you're providing and then reach over to you to get the service you're providing? How do I know about you? Like, fundamentally, like what's your URL that I need to go to make the call? And so it has service discovery all built in. It is built for microservice architectures. Really fast HTTP routing, really fast configuration, load balancing just out of the gate. So get your name signed up. The official logo is down here. It's actually a cool logo. The sticker's nice. Fill this out, and when the milestones start rolling in May and June, you'll get notified. And I promise you, if you thought anything about the Grails stuff was mildly interesting, you are going to just love Micronaut. I mean, when I write tests right now. I write unit tests, and I'm mocking stuff out because I don't want to pay a 20-second server startup time in order to do an integration test. But if my test is 1 second or a half a second to get the server started, I'm just going to write integration tests. I mean, the testing pyramid gets reshaped when you have like almost instant startup time. Because then why go to the trouble of mocking stuff out? If it's all services that you own, I mean, you might still mock out something downstream that you don't control because you don't control it. But if you control all the other services that you're interacting with, why not make them integration tests? Because you're going to start them up in a second and then do your test and be out of there in a second and a half. I mean, that's really powerful, just a change of thinking. So I wanted to mention that because I'm really excited about it. I think you will be, when you see it, you'll be as excited about it. The Groovy, I'm going to have some links up here. I'll show you in just a second. Let me get through here, get to the right place. All right. If you, okay, so that's it. This is the one that I'm going to get my cease and desist on. I am certain.
Is that
I think it is, but I don't know. Whoever owns it is going to say you used our thing. But anyway, it's promotion for those guys. Any questions? It's a big topic. I showed you the iceberg at the beginning. I tried to feed you as much of the iceberg as I could in an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. But there's just too much in here to go into any real depth. But if you're interested, reach out to the Grails folks, and start following the discussion list on Groovy. We have one of the committers on Groovy as Paul King. He's in Australia. He's on the OCI Grails team. So, I mean, these guys are really smart about what's going on in Groovy. So follow the list, follow the Grails discussions, and it's open source. So if we're not doing something you'd like to do, or you could improve, man, just jump in. You can help fix the docs. You could help. It's like, hey, I tried to get the scaffolding, but it's not working with Angular 5. And then you could put a PR in for fixing whatever, because it's the HTTP thing got broken, right? So I'll just change the HTTP client and change it from map to subscribe and fix it all up. You do it as a PR request, and you'd be, have a contribution into the project. Any questions?
So how did Worm start? Just originally a thin wrapper?
It was never a thin wrapper.